You would never expect that something as emotional as an engagement ring could turn into a full-blown courtroom battle. But that's exactly what happened in this case. And by the time Judge Judy heard the details, even she was shocked at how a simple agreement spiraled completely out of control. It all started with a couple who were preparing for one of the most important moments of their lives, their engagement. Like many people, they didn't want just any ring. They wanted something special, something custom-made, something that would represent their story. So they decided to go to a jeweler, someone they trusted to bring their vision to life. At first, everything seemed normal. The couple met with the jeweler, discussed designs, talked about stones, settings, and overall cost. According to the couple, the jeweler gave them a price estimate that felt reasonable for a custom engagement ring. It wasn't cheap, but it wasn't outrageous either. They agreed to move forward. Now here's where things begin to get complicated. The couple claims that they were very clear about their budget from the beginning. They say they trusted the jeweler to stay within that range or at least communicate clearly if anything changed. After all, when you're making something custom, there can always be slight adjustments. But those adjustments are supposed to be discussed, not decided unilaterally. Time passed, and the ring was being worked on. The couple was excited, imagining the final result, probably telling friends and family about it, planning the proposal, building anticipation. But behind the scenes, something else was happening that they had no idea about. According to the jeweler, the design process became more complicated than expected. Maybe the materials cost more, maybe the craftsmanship required more time, or maybe there were changes requested during the process. From the jeweler's perspective, the work justified a higher price. But here's the key issue. The couple says they were never properly informed that the cost was increasing significantly. Not just a little more, but according to them, the final price ended up being nearly 3 times the original estimate. Imagine expecting to pay one amount and then suddenly being told the cost has tripled. For most people, that's not just surprising, it's unacceptable. When the ring was finally ready, instead of a joyful moment, it turned into a confrontation. The couple was shocked by the final bill. They felt blindsided. In their minds, this wasn't what they agreed to at all. They believed the jeweler had gone ahead and increased the price without their consent. On the other hand, the jeweler had a completely different story. The jeweler claimed that the couple was aware of the changes, or at least should have been aware. According to them, custom work is unpredictable, and sometimes costs go up. They might have believed that the couple implicitly agreed by continuing with the process. Or maybe they thought the final product would justify the higher price. But here's where trust breaks down. In any business transaction, especially something as personal as an engagement ring, communication is everything. If one side believes something was clearly explained, and the other side insists it was never mentioned, then you already have a serious problem. The disagreement escalated quickly. What should have been a happy purchase turned into frustration, anger, and eventually a legal dispute. The couple felt they were being taken advantage of. The jeweler felt they deserved to be paid for their work. And just like that, this emotional situation landed in court. When they appeared in front of Judge Judy, it was no longer just about a ring. It was about trust, expectations, and whether a business has the right to dramatically increase a price without clear approval from the customer. Judge Judy immediately began asking sharp questions, trying to understand what exactly was agreed upon at the start. Was there a written contract? Was there a clear price limit? Were there any messages or proof showing that the couple was informed about the price increase? Because in cases like this, everything comes down to evidence. The couple insisted that they never approved such a massive increase. They likely argued that if they had known the real cost, they would have never gone ahead with the order in the first place. From their perspective, they were trapped. The ring was already made, and now they were being asked to pay an amount they never agreed to. The jeweler, however, stood firm. They probably explained the effort, the materials, the craftsmanship, and why the final price made sense from a business standpoint. To them, this wasn't a scam. This was simply the reality of custom work. But Judge Judy wasn't interested in assumptions or feelings. She wanted facts. And as the questioning continued, small details started to matter more and more. Who said what, when it was said, and whether there was any actual proof to support either side's claims. Because at the end of the day, It doesn't matter what you believe happened. In court, what matters is what you can prove. As the tension in the courtroom grew, it became clear that this case wasn't as simple as it first seemed. Both sides felt wronged. Both sides believed they were right. But only one version of the story would hold up under Judge Judy's scrutiny. And the real question was just beginning to take shape. Was this a case of a business fairly charging for unexpected work? Or was this a situation where a customer was blindsided with an outrageous bill they never agreed to? Because if the price really was tripled without proper consent, then that raises a serious issue about business ethics and consumer protection. But if the couple ignored warnings or failed to pay attention to changes, then maybe the responsibility wasn't entirely on the jeweler. The answer wasn't obvious yet. But one thing was certain. By the time Judge Judy reached her final verdict, someone was going to walk away feeling completely justified, and the other was going to learn a very expensive lesson. And what makes this case even more interesting is that situations like this happen more often than people think, especially when it comes to custom work where expectations and communication don't always align. So now the question is, if you were in that situation, who would you believe? Would you side with the couple who claims they were never told about the massive price increase, or the jeweler who insists the final cost was justified? And more importantly, if you were ordering something custom, how would you protect yourself from ending up in a situation like this? Because what happens next in this case changes everything, and the details that come out in court might completely shift your opinion about who is actually telling the truth. Suddenly, the tone inside the courtroom shifted as Judge Judy leaned forward, narrowing her eyes in that unmistakable way that usually means she has already sensed something isn't adding up. And from that moment on, it became less about a simple disagreement and more about uncovering exactly where the truth had been stretched. The first thing she focused on was the beginning of the agreement, because in her courtroom, everything starts there. What was promised, what was understood, and most importantly, what was documented. She asked the couple to clearly explain the original deal, not emotionally, but factually. How much were they told the ring would cost, and was that number written down anywhere? The couple explained that the jeweler had given them what they believed was a clear estimate. It wasn't just a vague conversation, at least not from their perspective. They walked in with a budget. They discussed options within that budget, and they left believing that the final cost would stay somewhere in that range. Maybe slightly higher, maybe with minor adjustments, but certainly not anywhere near triple the amount. Judge Judy listened carefully, but she didn't nod in agreement. She never does that too early. Instead, she asked a question that often determines the direction of cases like this. Do you have it in writing? There was a slight hesitation, and that hesitation mattered, because in legal disputes, especially involving money, a verbal understanding can quickly become unreliable. People remember things differently. What one person hears as a firm commitment, another may see as just an estimate. Without something written, everything becomes subjective. The couple admitted that they didn't have a detailed written contract specifying the final price. They might have had messages, maybe a receipt, maybe an initial quote, but nothing that clearly locked in the exact cost with no room for change. That was the first crack in their case. But Judge Judy didn't stop there. She turned to the jeweler, giving them the same opportunity to explain their side, but with a different kind of pressure. If the price really increased that dramatically, then where was the communication? Where was the proof that the customer had been informed and had agreed to continue? The jeweler began explaining the process in more detail. Custom jewelry, they said, isn't always predictable. Designs evolve, materials vary, and sometimes the original plan doesn't work the way it was intended. They might have mentioned specific changes. Perhaps the type of stone was upgraded, or the setting required more labor than initially expected. On the surface, it sounded reasonable, but Judge Judy wasn't interested in general explanations. She wanted specifics. She asked a very direct question. When the cost started increasing, did you inform them immediately? The jeweler responded, but not in a way that completely satisfied the question. There may have been mentions of ongoing communication, possibly updates during the process. But the clarity of those updates was now being questioned. Because saying we talked about it is not the same as proving that the customer clearly agreed to a higher price. The tension started building as Judge Judy pressed further. She asked for evidence, text messages, emails, invoices, anything that could show a timeline of communication, anything that could prove that the couple was aware of the rising cost before the ring was completed. This is where things often become very revealing, because if those messages exist and clearly show agreement, the jeweler's case becomes strong. But if they are vague, incomplete, or missing entirely, then it starts to look like the customer was left in the dark. The jeweler presented what they had. Perhaps there were messages, but maybe they didn't explicitly state the new total cost. Maybe they mentioned changes without attaching a clear price increase. Maybe they assumed the couple understood the implications. And assumptions in Judge Judy's courtroom are dangerous. She made it very clear that businesses cannot operate on assumptions. When it comes to charging customers, if you are going to increase a price, especially by such a large margin, you have to make that crystal clear. Not implied, not hinted at, but explicitly stated and agreed upon. At this point, you could see the couple becoming more confident. The more Judge Judy questioned the jeweler's communication, the more it seemed like there was a gap, a missing link where clear consent should have been. But then, the situation took another interesting turn. Judge Judy began questioning the couple again, but this time from a different angle. She wanted to know how involved they were during the process. Did they ask for updates? Did they check in? Did they question any changes that were mentioned? Because responsibility doesn't always lie on just one side. If the couple received messages about changes but chose not to clarify the cost, then that could weaken their position. Being a customer doesn't mean you can completely ignore warning signs and then claim surprise later. The couple insisted that they trusted the jeweler. They believed that any major change would be clearly communicated. They didn't think they needed to double-check every detail, because that's what they were paying the jeweler for: professional service and transparency. And that word, transparency, started to become central to the entire case. Judge Judy leaned back for a moment, processing everything she had heard so far. Her expression suggested that she was already forming an opinion, but she wasn't ready to reveal it yet. Instead, she focused on one crucial idea: expectation versus reality. The couple expected a ring within a certain budget. The jeweler delivered a ring that cost significantly more. Somewhere between those 2 points, communication failed. But the real question was, who was responsible for that failure? Was it the jeweler's duty to make sure every cost increase was clearly approved? Or was it the couple's responsibility to stay informed and ask questions throughout the process? This is where cases like this become less about right and wrong, and more about reasonable behavior. What would a reasonable business do? What would a reasonable customer do? And did either side fall short of that standard? As the courtroom discussion continued, the emotional aspect of the case became more visible. This wasn't just about money anymore. For the couple, this ring symbolized a major life moment. And instead of joy, it brought stress and conflict. For the jeweler, this was their work, their time, their craftsmanship, and they likely felt it was being undervalued. Two completely different perspectives, both feeling justified, but only one could win. Judge Judy began preparing to connect all the pieces, and you could tell that the next phase of the case was going to be critical. Because now that both sides had presented their stories, it was time to break them down, detail by detail, and determine which version actually held up under scrutiny. And just when it seemed like the case was starting to become predictable, a few key details emerged that had the potential to completely change how everything was being viewed. Details that raised new questions, details that challenged earlier statements, details that could shift the balance in an instant. Because in a courtroom, the smallest detail can sometimes make the biggest difference. And as those details began to surface, one thing became very clear. This case was far from over, and the final outcome was still very much uncertain. So now think about this carefully. If you were Judge Judy, standing there with both sides presenting incomplete but confident arguments, what would matter more to you? The lack of a written agreement, or the possibility that one side failed to communicate honestly? And if you were in the couple's position, would you have trusted the process the same way? Or would you have demanded constant updates before allowing the work to continue? Because what comes next doesn't just reveal more facts. It forces a decision that could either validate trust or punish it. And once that decision is made, there's no going back. Interestingly, just when it seemed like the case was leaning in one direction, Judge Judy shifted the entire focus with a line of questioning that caught both sides slightly off guard. Because instead of continuing to debate what was said, she started examining what was actually done. She asked the jeweler to walk through the process step by step, not in general terms, but in exact sequence. When did the design begin? When were changes made? When did costs start increasing? And most importantly, at what exact point did the price move beyond the original estimate? The jeweler began explaining, but this time the details started to sound less solid. There were mentions of adjustments, mentions of improvements, mentions of necessary upgrades, but the timeline wasn't as clear as it needed to be. And that lack of clarity started to matter more than anything else. Because when someone is asking for more money, especially a lot more money, the expectation is simple. You document it. You communicate it. You confirm it. Judge Judy pointed out something very direct without raising her voice, which somehow made it even more powerful. She essentially made it clear that if you are running a business, you don't get to decide the final price after the work is done and then expect the customer to simply accept it. That moment shifted the energy in the room. The jeweler tried to justify the situation by emphasizing the quality of the ring. They may have described the craftsmanship, the detail, the uniqueness of the final product, almost as if the beauty of the ring itself should explain the cost. But Judge Judy didn't even entertain that argument for long, because in her courtroom, the issue wasn't whether the ring was beautiful. The issue was whether the customer agreed to pay for it. And those are two completely different things. She turned back to the couple and asked them something that seemed simple on the surface but carried a lot of weight. When you were informed about changes, did you ever ask how much more it would cost? The couple paused, and that pause spoke volumes. They admitted that they didn't always ask for exact numbers. Sometimes they assumed the changes were minor. Sometimes they believed the jeweler would stay within reason. And sometimes they simply trusted the process. That honesty helped them in one way, but hurt them in another. The couple paused, and that pause spoke volumes. They admitted that they didn't always ask for exact numbers. Sometimes they assumed the changes were minor. Sometimes they believed the jeweler would stay within reason. And sometimes they simply trusted the process. That honesty helped them in one way, but hurt them in another, because while it made them seem genuine, it also showed that they weren't completely proactive in protecting themselves. Judge Judy acknowledged that, but she didn't let it shift the core responsibility. She made a distinction that became one of the most important points of the case. A customer trusting a professional does not give that professional unlimited freedom to increase costs without explicit approval. That line, whether spoken exactly like that or implied through her reasoning, defined the direction the case was heading. The jeweler, sensing that things were not going in their favor, tried to bring the focus back to the work itself. They may have argued that backing out after the ring was completed would leave them at a loss, that the time, effort, and materials had already been invested, and it wouldn't be fair for them to absorb that cost. And from a business perspective, that argument does carry some weight. But Judge Judy immediately balanced it with a stronger point. Fairness in business does not come after the fact. It comes from clear agreements before the work is done. If you fail to secure that agreement, you take on the risk. That idea hit hard, because it reframed the entire situation. It wasn't just about whether the price increase was justified. It was about who took the risk of moving forward without confirming that increase. And in that framing, the jeweler appeared to be the one who assumed the risk. The courtroom atmosphere grew more intense as both sides realized that the case was no longer about emotions or intentions. It had become a matter of responsibility. Who had the responsibility to ensure clarity? Who had the responsibility to confirm consent? Who had the responsibility to prevent exactly this kind of situation from happening? Judge Judy then circled back to the evidence, or rather, the lack of strong evidence. She highlighted the absence of a clear written agreement for the increased price. No signed approval. No message explicitly stating the new total and receiving confirmation. And that absence started to outweigh everything else. Because in situations involving money, especially large amounts, clarity is everything. Without it, even the most reasonable explanation can fall apart. The jeweler attempted one more angle, possibly suggesting that the couple should have known that such a custom piece would cost more than the initial estimate, that it was unrealistic to expect the original price to remain unchanged given the complexity of the work. But Judge Judy didn't accept that as a justification. She made it clear that expectations are not the same as agreements. You cannot charge based on what you think someone should have expected. You can only charge based on what they actually agreed to. That distinction closed one of the last doors the jeweler had. At this point, the direction of the case was becoming clearer. But Judge Judy still wasn't ready to give her final judgment. She often takes her time in these moments, not because she is unsure, but because she wants to make sure every angle has been considered. And then, she addressed something that had been underlying the entire case but hadn't been directly stated yet. Accountability. She pointed out that both sides made mistakes. The couple for not insisting on clear written terms and not questioning changes more carefully. The jeweler for failing to communicate price increases in a direct, undeniable way. But in legal terms, not all mistakes carry the same weight. One side made an error in judgment. The other may have made an error in business practice. And those are not treated equally. The room grew quieter as it became obvious that the final decision was close. You could almost feel the anticipation building. Because cases like this don't just end with a simple answer. They end with a lesson. A lesson about trust. A lesson about communication. A lesson about what happens when assumptions replace clarity. And just before delivering what everyone had been waiting for, Judge Judy took one last look at both parties, almost as if giving them a final chance to reflect on how things had escalated so far. Because once she speaks, that's it. No more explanations. No more arguments. Just a decision. So now think about this for a second. If you were running a business, would you ever move forward with expensive, custom work without getting clear approval for every price change? And if you were the customer, would you rely on trust alone? Or would you demand every detail in writing before allowing the process to continue? Because what comes next isn't just a verdict, it's a reality check. And depending on how you see it, it might completely change how you handle situations like this in your own life. Finally, after listening to both sides, examining the gaps, and cutting through all the unnecessary explanations, Judge Judy leaned forward and began speaking in a tone that instantly silenced the room, because everyone knew this was the moment where everything would be decided. She didn't rush. She never does. Instead, she started by summarizing the situation in a way that stripped it down to its core, removing all the emotions, all the assumptions, and all the excuses. She made it clear that this case was not about whether the ring was beautiful, not about how much effort went into making it, and not even about whether the final price could be justified in theory. This case, she explained, was about agreement, and more specifically, whether there was a clear and mutual agreement for the final price that was being demanded. She looked directly at the jeweler and pointed out the most critical failure in their entire argument. If you intend to charge a customer significantly more than the original estimate, especially something as extreme as tripling the cost, then it is your responsibility to make that increase absolutely clear and to get direct approval before continuing the work. Not after, not assumed, not implied. Before. That word seemed to hang in the air. Before. Because that's where everything had gone wrong. The jeweler tried to maintain composure, but it was becoming obvious that the foundation of their defense was weakening. They had relied too heavily on the idea that the work itself would justify the cost. But in Judge Judy's courtroom, justification without agreement simply isn't enough. Then she turned to the couple, and for a brief moment, it almost seemed like she might criticize them more heavily, because she acknowledged something important. She pointed out that they were not entirely without fault. They trusted too easily. They didn't demand clear written confirmation. They allowed the process to continue, without fully understanding the financial implications. But then she made a distinction that changed everything. She said that while their behavior may not have been cautious, it did not give the jeweler the right to impose a dramatically higher price without explicit consent. That line effectively separated poor judgment from legal responsibility. And in doing so, it made it clear which side carried the greater burden. The courtroom was completely still at this point, because everyone could feel what was coming. Judge Judy then delivered the part that truly defined the case. She explained that in business, especially when dealing with custom work, the risk of unclear communication falls on the professional, not the customer. The professional is the one with experience. The professional is the one setting the terms. The professional is the one who understands the potential for costs to increase. And because of that, the professional is also the one responsible for making sure those increases are clearly approved. If they fail to do that, they cannot later demand payment based on assumptions. That was the turning point. And then, without raising her voice, without adding any unnecessary drama, she gave her verdict. She ruled in favor of the couple, but the decision didn't come without nuance. Instead of simply dismissing the jeweler's work entirely, she focused on what was fair based on what had actually been agreed upon. She essentially limited the payment to something closer to the original estimate, or at least to a reasonable range that could be justified by what the couple had knowingly accepted. The additional amount, the excessive increase that was never clearly approved, was not enforceable. In other words, the jeweler would not be allowed to collect the full tripled price. That outcome hit hard, because it meant that despite all the work, all the effort, and all the materials, the jeweler would have to absorb the loss created by their own lack of clear communication. You could almost feel the weight of that realization settle in. For the couple, it was a moment of relief. They weren't being forced to pay an amount they never agreed to. Their trust, while perhaps misplaced, was not being punished in a way that would leave them financially overwhelmed. For the jeweler, it was a tough lesson, not about craftsmanship, but about business practices, about the importance of clarity, documentation, and explicit approval. But what made this case even more impactful was not just the verdict itself, but the message behind it. Because Judge Judy didn't just resolve a dispute, she highlighted a principle that applies far beyond this courtroom. In any transaction, especially one involving customization and changing variables, communication is not optional, it is everything. And when that communication fails, the consequences don't just affect the outcome of a deal, they define it. As the case came to an end, both sides walked away with something. One side walked away with a legal victory. The other walked away with a costly lesson. But neither walked away unchanged. Because situations like this leave an impression. They change how people approach trust. They change how people handle agreements. They change how people protect themselves in the future. And maybe that's the real takeaway here. Because at first glance, this case looks like it's about a ring. But in reality, it's about something much bigger. It's about the moment where expectations collide with reality. It's about what happens when trust replaces clarity. And it's about who pays the price when things go wrong. But even after the verdict, one question still lingers. And it's not as simple as who won and who lost. Because depending on how you look at it, you might see this case very differently. You might see a customer who was taken advantage of. Or you might see a business that wasn't properly protected. And that's what makes this case so interesting. Because the answer isn't just about law. It's about perspective. Now here's the part that really stays with you long after the case is over. Because even though a verdict was given and the courtroom moved on, the situation itself leaves behind questions that don't have such simple answers. And depending on how you look at it, you might actually find yourself going back and forth on who was truly right. At first, it feels obvious. A customer was given one price, and then later asked to pay nearly 3 times that amount without clear approval. And when you hear it like that, it almost sounds unfair without needing much explanation. Most people would instantly side with the couple, because no one likes the idea of being surprised with a bill they never agreed to. But then, when you take a step back and look at it from another angle, things start to feel a little less black and white. Because this wasn't a ready-made product sitting on a shelf. Now here's the part that really stays with you long after the case is over. Because even though a verdict was given and the courtroom moved on, the situation itself leaves behind questions that don't have such simple answers. And depending on how you look at it, you might actually find yourself going back and forth on who was truly right. At first, it feels obvious. A customer was given one price, and then later asked to pay nearly 3 times that amount without clear approval. And when you hear it like that, it almost sounds unfair without needing much explanation. Most people would instantly side with the couple, because no one likes the idea of being surprised with a bill they never agreed to. But then, when you take a step back and look at it from another angle, things start to feel a little less black and white. Because this wasn't a ready-made product sitting on a shelf. This was custom work. Time, effort, skill, and materials all went into creating something unique. Something that couldn't just be returned or resold easily. Once that process started, the jeweler was already investing resources. And if changes were being made along the way, then those changes likely came with real costs. So then the question becomes a little more complicated. And if you were the jeweler, would you have continued the work without getting clear approval for every price increase? Or would you have stopped everything the moment the cost started going beyond the original estimate? Do you think the final decision was completely fair? Or do you feel like one side still got the short end of the deal? And here's the most important question. In a situation like this, who do you think should carry more responsibility? The business for not communicating clearly, or the customer for not asking enough questions? Because your answer to that question says a lot about how you see trust, responsibility, and fairness in real life. Drop your opinion in the comments, because this is one of those cases where every perspective adds something new to the conversation. And who knows, the way you see it might be completely different from someone else. And that's what makes discussions like this worth having. Because at the end of the day, it's not just about who won. It's about what you learned from it, and whether that lesson sticks with you the next time you find yourself in a situation where expectations and reality don't quite match.